Hi, thank you so much for joining me in celebrating Black History Month. For those that don't know me, my name is India Williams and I'm the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Lead at Newport City Homes. So today we're really going to get into Black history and find out about Black people that have contributed to the infrastructure and economy of Wales, Newport and a little bit wider. So when we think about Black history and people arriving in the UK, we do tend to typically think back to the Winchester generation of 1948 and that influx of people joining us from the Commonwealth. And maybe you might think a little bit further back than that. You might think of the transatlantic slave trade in around the 1600s, but we don't really tend to think much further back than that. And actually, Black history in Britain started back way, way before. So today what we're going to do is we're going to look at Black people arriving in Europe in 55,000 years before the Common Era, and we're going to talk all the way through up until today. And then later on in Black History Month, we'll touch on a little bit more modern Black history. But yeah, I'm going to talk you through a timeline of kind of what you can expect from Newport and how Newport's developed with the help of many thousands of Black people. So let's take it away. So as I've just referenced, there's evidence of Black people arriving in Europe around 55,000 years before the Common Era, and they're actually recorded as the first people. They're the oldest skeletons basically that we've found in Europe. And then let's bring that into Britain. So following that, actually the oldest and most intact skeleton that we've ever found in Britain is around 10,000 years old, and that was found in Cheddar in Somerset. And when archaeologists kind of examined that, they found out that person, using the DNA in their year, was actually a person with dark skin. So we know straight away that there were Black people in Britain 10,000 years ago, so a little bit older than 1948. So then following that, we are going to think about Stonehenge. So we know that Stonehenge was built around 2,000 to 3,000 years before the Common Era. Now, many historians actually believe that there's a good chance that Stonehenge could have been built by Buddhist East Africans that were living in that area around 3,000 years before Common Era. Following that, we have got the Roman invasion, which obviously, as you know, is kind of around, I don't want to get this wrong here, but I think it's around the 50 years into Common Era, and when the Romans invaded Britain, they recorded that there was already plenty of Black people living here. So that's pretty interesting, isn't it? And actually, further to that, when the Romans had invaded the UK, they'd not long conquered Northern Africa. And when they came over, they actually brought lots of Black soldiers with them into the UK. So that's another influx of Black people. And actually, the ruler, so during part of the Roman occupation, one of the rulers of England, though it wasn't England then, but England and Wales, was a guy called Septimus Severus. And he was actually stationed in South Wales for a lot of his time, obviously because it was so lovely. But yeah, so we know that back sort of during Roman occupation, that actually Wales was ruled by a Black man from Libya. So pretty interesting. Then if we move on and we think about when Muslims arrived in the UK, there's documentation that there seems to be an influx of Muslim people arriving between the 9th and the 10th centuries. And actually it's believed that King Offa, though we don't think that King Offa was a Black man, we do think he was Muslim, and we know that he had lots of connections with Europe and with Africa, and sort of built his religious and belief systems based on his connections with the wider continent. So very interesting. So we're going to fast forward a bit in time now. We're going to go to colonialism in the 1600s. And that's when we probably are more starting to think about Black people being in Britain and Europe, etc. Now, a lot of you will already know quite a lot about colonialism. But we're going to think about Britain occupying some of the Caribbean islands in the 1600s, and we're going to think about one particularly famous individual who is Sir Henry Morgan, aka, if you like a bit of rum, Captain Morgan's. So Captain Morgan was actually the son of the wealthiest family in Wales in the 1600s, and they made a huge amount of their money from being private landlords. And where were they private landlords of? Newport. So Newport and Cardiff, they owned over 90,000 acres, and that's how they made all of their money. So whilst he was living in Llanrumney, and then following that, he, as you probably know, got on a ship, took some Caribbean islands, and then he actually became the Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. Now, during that time when Britain went over and we took the Caribbean islands, when we were at war with France and Spain, etc., at that time, we took Irish prisoners of war over to the Caribbean islands, and they were kind of doing a lot of the slave labor, so to speak, for us. But then that was superseded by the transatlantic slave trade, and then obviously that's when you've got a huge amount of black people being taken from Africa over to the Caribbean islands and then being used to do a lot of labor. And that is where we see a huge amount of wealth coming from the Caribbean islands to Newport and Cardiff, because Sir Henry Morgan, Captain Morgan, he bought a plantation in Jamaica when he was the governor of Jamaica, and he started a big rum plantation there. And actually, this is where they think that the name rum comes from, because he's from Rumney and Llanrumney, his family, and he had a rum plantation, and that's why they think that rum is known as rum. Very interesting fact. But he had a large, so when he bought the plantation in Jamaica, he inherited 100 black slaves, and unfortunately he was known to not be a particularly pleasant guy and did mistreat those black slaves, so that's very, very sad. But then the labour of those black people in Jamaica at the time were used obviously to produce sugar, to produce rum, and then that wealth came back into Wales, into Cardiff and Newport, and then that was used to actually build a lot of infrastructure in Newport. And apparently that wealth, particularly from black people in Jamaica, was what developed all of Newport Road, because historically in the 1600s, apparently Newport Road was just had a village, and then was just really, really forested. So yes, thanks to black people, that's why we have Newport Road and all of that commercial area. And then again, a lot of the wealth that was in Newport and helped to build Newport's economy and infrastructure. So, you know, really grateful of black people and black labour during that time. And then at the same time that was happening over in the Caribbean, that's obviously when you've also got the slave trade kind of just really starting to make its way into Britain as well. And that's when we had a lot of black people shipped directly into Wales and the rest of the UK from Africa. So following on from colonialism, that's when we're going to talk a little bit about World War One and then World War Two. So in World War One, we actually, it's well documented, there's plenty of photos of black people supporting the UK, the Britain in World War One. So during World War One, that's when you had an influx of black people being shipped from the Commonwealth to Britain to be able to relieve white men to be able to go off to war. So they were then used in all sorts of jobs in Britain, but that's when we start to see black miners, black dock workers, etc. And then in fact, obviously they did support us in the war, and black people were unfortunately used for some of the most dangerous jobs in the war. So there's a lot of documentation and proof that black people were used to stack the bombshells, and they were used to dig trenches, polish white men's boots, wash our clothes, etc. So they were, you know, they were kind of used for some of the most menial jobs, but also some of the most dangerous jobs during World War One. So following World War One, that's when you had a lot of black men coming back to Britain and settling in Newport and Cardiff. And that's a lot of single black men, for you to note. You know, they weren't coming over with their families. So as they were coming back and they were settling into Newport, looking for jobs, you had quite a lot of black men, as I said, were miners, they were dock workers, seamen, etc. And basically, unfortunately, they were seen as competition for white men for the jobs, because obviously following World War One, you did have a really weak economy, and there weren't many jobs available. So white men were quite threatened by black men, because for the first time you'd see a lot of black men coming in and marrying white women. So yes, you did see a lot of black men coming in, marrying white women, and taking jobs, you know, extremely hard workers. And they were competition. They were really seen as competition. And that really caused some animosity amongst white men in and around Newport, across all of Wales. You know, and this is when we're going to talk about the Newport race riots. And of course, the race riots in South Wales started in Newport, but then they went on to also happen in Cardiff and Barry. And at the same time, they were also happening over in America. So it was a really common thing, you know, that this competition for jobs, and, you know, it really caused some difficulties. So the Newport race riots started in June 1919, and what happened is you had a black soldier in Newport, and I think he said something that was perceived as offensive to a white woman. And I think, to be honest, people were just kind of looking for something that was just going to start it. We were very sensitive. As I said, there was a lot of competition around the jobs and women, etc. So when this black man said something perceived as offensive to a white woman, a white man took that with, you know, great offence, and he started an attack against this black man. And then before you know it, there was hundreds of white men ganging up against this black man, attacking the black man, finding all sorts of weapons, anything that they could get their hands on. And it turned from that isolated incident into something huge. This huge white mob formed, and they were attacking absolutely anybody who wasn't white. So it started off with black men, and apparently records from the police said that there was a huge white mob between about 1,000 to 1,500 men formed outside a black boarding house on George Street. They went in, they turned out all of the furniture, they were built up all the furniture in the street, set it on fire. It was chaos. And then what they did is they moved along, and then they went to Commercial Road, Repairer Street, Bowl Street, Canal Terrace. They really, you know, they went all around central Newport, and that they, you know, they went to Chinese boarding houses. They went to a Mexican and Arabic boarding house, and it just became this huge racial attack, based on all the tension that had been building up around that competition. So, you know, an enormously sad time. And then, as I said, the race riots, they went on, and they happened in Cardiff and Barry, which actually saw more loss than the Newport ones. But one thing I think, although it is enormously sad, I think the one thing that is good to note in the Newport race riots, which happened, and it didn't happen in Cardiff and Barry, is white witnesses came forward and they did testify against white people to support black people. So, you know, I guess in terms of the racism that was happening, at least in Newport, there was already some support for the black community, which is really positive. But yes, so following on from the race riots, you then got World War II. I think it's really well known that in World War II, you know, black people supported in the war effort enormously, and that all came about in the Windrush generation, which we'll go on to now. So, as you know, in Windrush generation, which was in 1948, basically the free movement law came in, where Britain had said that there should be free movement between all of the Commonwealth countries, and it was really to encourage people from other parts of the Commonwealth to come to Britain and help rebuild Britain. And black people, particularly black people in the Caribbean, got really behind this, and they were really passionate about coming over to the UK and rebuilding the mother country. So a lot of people, men, women, children, huge families, single people, would come over to the UK. They arrived here to work in jobs. Obviously, the infrastructure of the country was obliterated. So there was lots and lots of jobs needed to help rebuild the country. Now, during this time in post-war, white men had worked extremely hard during the war, defending their country, and a lot of them had kind of gotten quite prestigious jobs and things through the military, and therefore they wanted to kind of maintain that status that they'd worked really hard to build. And they didn't want to go back to what was perceived at the time as unskilled jobs. So of course we know they're skilled. So that was kind of what was perceived as sort of like bin men, bus drivers, etc. Those are really unpopular jobs at the time. So black people came in and, they picked up the slack, and they worked really, really hard, cleaning the streets, driving our buses, etc. And they needed a lot of women that came over from the Caribbean, qualified teachers, qualified nurses, qualified accountants, etc., that came over. And bearing in mind, they had done PGCEs, the equivalent in the Caribbean, that were regulated and by British education systems, but when they arrived in the UK, we didn't recognise those qualifications. So these really talented black women who worked in really skilled jobs back in the Caribbean, they had to come into the UK and work in what was perceived at the time as unskilled roles. And from 1948 right the way through to 1990, it was documented that 98% of black women were working in full-time employment, and those jobs are quite typically maids, cleaners, etc. And then they were used as hospital cleaners, auxiliary nurses, etc. But they weren't respected in terms of using their nursing qualifications. They were used to like change bedpans, change bed sheets. They were given the most unsanitary jobs. And also during this time, white doctors, they did not want to treat black people. So this is where we see another influx as well. So what we had to do as Britain, because obviously we had plenty of black people in Britain at this point, but we had white medical professionals not wanting to treat black people, is we then had to go and we had to ship people from Africa to Britain and then put them through medical training so that they could treat all of the black people. So we actually had a lot of black women working in the NHS at this time as auxiliary nurses, and they were paying into taxes, so that they were starting to pay into the NHS, but actually despite paying in those taxes for years and years and years, they were not allowed to take anything back. They were not entitled to access the NHS. They weren't entitled to take from our welfare system. So it's enormously sad. I think it's really, really important, like huge amounts that they were contributing to rebuilding the economy, and at great personal sacrifice, and they weren't getting things back from that. So I think with the Windrush generation scandal, where people were told to come to the UK to rebuild the mother country, they worked enormously hard at quite little benefit to themselves and their families. When we started to try and deport people in recent times back to the Caribbean, it was just absolutely shocking because of how much they had invested in Britain and rebuilding us and getting us to where we are today. And I think another thing that's kind of really important to note is the fact that there was racial segregation in the UK in this time. When we think about segregation, we often think about in America, don't we? It's really well publicised about the racial segregation in America, but actually that really happened here in the UK, which is not really talked about that much. But black people, they weren't allowed to just go into our hotels and our restaurants and our swimming pools. And actually a big strike happened in Cardiff because there was lots of black bus drivers in Cardiff, but although they were allowed to drive our buses, black people weren't allowed to go onto our buses and be passengers on our buses, which is just obviously outrageous. So this huge strike happened in Cardiff. And elsewhere in the UK that started to happen. And then that's when in 1965 they introduced the Race Relation Act, and that started to break down all of that segregation. And then in 1969 you had the first reggae #1 hit, The Israelites, which many of us know. And that really started to introduce Black music and politics and that kind of Black history within the music, and it started to raise the profile of Black people and their suffering and what they'd been through. And then obviously you've got Bob Marley, or it was the Wailers, obviously just not Bob Marley but just the Wailers at the time. And then they were really big around 1973, and they started to really give Black people a voice through political poetry. And then, really excitedly at the time, Bob Marley came to Cardiff, and apparently it was huge, absolutely huge, this Bob Marley event in Cardiff in the 70s. And he came, and he specifically came to Cardiff because he wanted to address the fact that there was a really large Jamaican and Black population in Cardiff during this time. I think the other thing that I think is really important to note is that as I've talked you through all of this history, everything that's been happening, a huge Black community, but not just a Black community, people from all across the world were settling in Cardiff and Newport, and they are very multicultural cities. Now, Cardiff is known to be really multicultural in the fact that it's quite unique. So in Cardiff, lots of people from all sorts of different ethnicities. There's over 200 different ethnicities being settled in Cardiff for over 100 years, and they live together side by side in harmony. So, in America, in Australia, and some of the other westernized countries, you do see a lot of ethnicities segregated. They're living in different communities. You've got your Chinatowns and things like that. But actually in Cardiff, it's unique in the fact that a lot of people do tend to live together. I think that Cardiff's a really great example of showing how we can all live together in unity and harmony and support each other. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour from me, although it's probably gone on quite long. But I hope that that's really helped to demonstrate to you some of the stuff that Black people and mixed-race people have brought to Newport, Cardiff, surrounding areas in Britain within the last, more than 55,000 years. So I think hopefully I've abolished the myth that Black people are quite new in Britain. They certainly aren't, and we've got a lot to be thankful to them for. So yes, thank you so much for joining me, and stay tuned for the rest of the exciting events we've got during Black History Month. Take care. Thank you.